In 1994, a paper landed in a respected, peer-reviewed statistics journal that should never have been able to get published there. Its claim sounded more like something from a tabloid than an academic journal. 3 Israeli mathematicians said they had found a hidden code buried inside the Hebrew text of Genesis, a code that encoded the names of famous rabbis, alongside their birth and death dates, encrypted centuries before those men were even born. The paper passed peer review. It appeared in Statistical Science, one of the most rigorous journals in the field, and it set off a controversy that pulled in mathematicians, journalists, skeptics, and religious scholars for the next decade. Some people walked away convinced they had found proof of the divine origin of Scripture. Others spent years trying to prove it was nothing more than an elaborate statistical illusion. This is the story of the Bible Code: real research, real controversy, and a real scientific reckoning that followed. The idea itself wasn't new. For centuries, Jewish scholars had explored the concept of hidden meanings inside the Torah, treating the text as something layered with significance beyond its surface reading. But the modern version of this idea started with a rabbi named Michael Beer Weissmandl in the mid-20th century, who noticed that if you counted letters at fixed intervals in the Hebrew text of the Torah, certain words seemed to emerge. He noted, for example, that counting every 50th letter starting from the first letter Tav in Genesis spelled out the word Torah. It seemed like an odd coincidence, interesting enough to note, but not enough to build a scientific claim on. Decades later, 3 Israeli researchers picked up where Weissmandl left off, but this time armed with something he never had. Computers. Doron Witztum, Eliyahu Rips, and Yov Rosenberg used what's called the equidistant letter sequence method, or ELSE. The concept is Stry-Gottfried to describe, even if the underlying mathematics gets complicated fast. Take the Hebrew text of the Torah, strip out all spaces and punctuation so it becomes one uninterrupted stream of letters, and then search for words by skipping a fixed number of letters at a time. Skip every 3rd letter, or every 12th, or every 100th, in either direction, forwards or backwards, and see if meaningful words emerge. In any long enough text, this kind of search will inevitably turn up some words purely by chance. That's just math. But Witztum, Rips, and Rosenberg claimed something much bigger than a handful. Coincidental hits. They said that when they searched for the names of 32 famous rabbis, encoded near their names, they also found the correct dates of birth or death for those same rabbis, appearing far more often than random chance should allow. They ran the analysis, calculated probabilities, and submitted it to Statistical Science, and in a moment that stunned much of the academic world, it was accepted and published in 1994 under the title Equidistant Letter Sequences in the Book of Genesis. This detail matters more than almost anything else in the story. This wasn't a self-published pamphlet or a fringe website. Statistical Science is a legitimate, respected, peer-reviewed academic journal. Getting a paper accepted there requires passing scrutiny from expert statisticians who have no religious stake in the outcome. The journal's editor at the time, Robert Cass, later explained the reasoning behind publication. The editors found the statistical methodology puzzling. They could not immediately identify an obvious flaw in the calculations, even though the conclusion struck most of them as implausible on its face, rather than simply rejecting the paper because the conclusion seemed too extraordinary. The editors decided to publish it specifically as a kind of scientific challenge. Cass essentially said, "We don't believe this. We can't explain exactly why it's wrong, so let's put it in front of the entire statistical community and see if anyone can identify the flaw." That decision turned out to be the spark that lit years of investigation, rebuttal, and public fascination. The academic paper alone might have stayed inside statistics departments, debated quietly among specialists. What exploded it into global public consciousness was a journalist named Michael Drosnin. In 1997, Drosnin published a book called The Bible Code, which took the core idea from the Witztum Rips Rosenberg paper and pushed it dramatically further. Drosnin didn't just claim the code identified historical figures after the fact. He claimed it could reveal information about events that hadn't happened yet. The book became an international bestseller, translated into dozens of languages, discussed on major television programs, and debated in newspapers around the world. Drosnin's most famous claim centered on the assassination of Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. Drosnin said that months before Rabin was shot in 1995, he had found Rabin's name encoded in the Torah crossed by the phrase "assassin that will assassinate." He claimed he had even warned Rabin directly, sending a note through an intermediary warning of an impending assassination encoded in the biblical text when Rabin was subsequently assassinated by Yigal Amir. The story exploded. Too many people, it felt like undeniable proof. A code embedded thousands of years ago in ancient Hebrew script had somehow anticipated the death of a sitting prime minister, and someone had found it before it happened. The claim was extraordinary, and it demanded serious scrutiny. It got exactly that. Almost as soon as Drosnin's book became a sensation, mathematicians and statisticians began publishing rebuttals. Chief among them was Brendan M.K., an Australian computer scientist and mathematician who became one of the most prominent and persistent critics of the entire Bible code phenomenon. McKay's approach was elegantly devastating. If the ELS method genuinely detected some hidden supernatural signal unique to the Torah, then applying the same method to any other lengthy text should fail to produce similarly striking results. So McKay and his colleagues ran the identical statistical methods on other long texts. They tried Tolstoy's War and Peace. They tried other novels. They tried Hebrew translations of unrelated books. The results were damning for the Bible code claim. Using the same equidistant letter sequence technique, McKay's team found similarly striking patterns of names and related information embedded in War and Peace and other bouquets that had absolutely no claim to ancient prophetic origin. If a Tolstoy novel translated into Hebrew could produce similar patterns of assassination predictions or rabbi birthdates, then the presence of such patterns in the Torah couldn't be treated as unique evidence of anything, let alone divine authorship. It strongly suggested that what Whitstone, Rips, and Rosenberg had actually discovered was simply an artifact of how flexible the ELS method is, combined with the sheer number of ways you can search for patterns in a long text. McKay didn't stop there. He and other researchers, including Israeli mathematician Maya Bar-Hillel, published a detailed rebuttal directly challenging the statistical methodology of the original 1994 paper. Their critique focused heavily on something crucial in any statistical analysis: the way researchers selected which rabbis to search for, and which name spellings and date formats to accept as valid matches. If researchers have flexibility in choosing which variations of a name count as a match, and flexibility in choosing which historical dates to test against, the appearance of statistical significance can be manufactured are the fact, even unintentionally, simply through the enormous number of researcher choices involved in the process. This is a well-documented probable in statistics generally, sometimes called the multiple comparisons problem, or more informally, researcher degrees of freedom. Give a researcher enough flexibility in how they define a match, and meaningful-looking patterns will emerge from almost any sufficiently large dataset, purely by chance. McKay's rebuttal was eventually published, ironically, in the very same journal that had published the original paper. Statistical Science ran the counter-analysis, effectively closing the loop the editors had opened years earlier when they published the original paper specifically to invite scrutiny, the mathematical core of McKay. And Bar-Hillel's critique deserves a closer look, because it explains exactly how something that felt statistically impossible turned out to be statistically unremarkable once examined more carefully. The original researchers had used a specific measure of how close in physical proximity within the text the encoded names appeared next to their corresponding dates. They then compared this measure to what would be expected under a model of pure randomness. Their claim was that the actual proximity foo-end in the Torah was so much tighter than random chance predicted that it pointed to deliberate design. The rebuttal team argued that the original study had allowed too much flexibility in exactly how a successful match was defined, both in terms of alternate spellings of names common in Hebrew, and in terms of which of several possible dates associated with a historical rabbi counted as valid. Small adjustments to these definitions, adjustments that seemed reasonable and defensible on their own, could shift the calculated probability dramatically when McKay's team applied stricter, pre-registered criteria decided in advance rather than adjusted after seeing results. The striking statistical significance largely evaporated. This is one of the most important lessons to come out of the entire controversy, and it extends far beyond questions of religious text. It illustrates a real and common danger in any kind of pattern searching research, whether you're looking for hidden codes in ancient scripture, searching financial data for predictive patterns, or analyzing scientific datasets for correlations. Given enough flexibility in how you define success and enough opportunities to search, meaningful-looking patterns will appear even in random noise. The rigor of a claim depends entirely on whether the criteria for success were locked in before the analysis or adjusted afterward to fit whatever was found. What made the Bible code controversy unusually accessible, compared to many scientific debates, is that regular people could actually replicate parts of the analysis themselves. Software eventually became available that let anyone search for equidistant letter sequences in various texts, Hebrew or otherwise. Enthusiasts and skeptics alike ran their own searches, and unsurprisingly, people found what they were looking for in all sorts of texts, not just the Torah, names of celebrities, dates of unrelated historical events, and predictions of all kinds turned up in novels, phone books, and translated texts that had zero claim to ancient origin. Brendan McKay went further still, publishing tongue-in-cheek analyses showing that if you applied similar loose methodology, you could find codes in Moby Dick predicting the assassination of a different world leader entirely, or codes appearing to predict events that had nothing to do with the original text's content or era. The point wasn't that these findings were meaningful either. The point was to demonstrate, clearly and repeatedly, just how easy it is to generate impressive-sounding coincidences once you allow enough flexibility in your search parameters. The most emotionally powerful piece of the entire Bible code phenomenon, Drosnin's claim about warning Rabin before his assassination, also came under scrutiny once people looked closely at the actual sequence of events. Critics pointed out that political assassination was, unfortunately, a recurring possibility being discussed regarding several high-profile Israeli and world leaders during that politically tense period, a general warning about assassin Asian risk aimed at a sitting prime minister during an era of serious political tension and violence was not, on its own, an extraordinary prediction, code or no code. It's also worth noting that Drosnin's own methodology for identifying predictionists in advance, as opposed to noticing patterns retroactively after an event already occurred, was never independently verified under controlled conditions before the fact. This distinction between predicting something before it happens under controlled, verifiable conditions and noticing a pattern that seems to match something after it has already occurred is central to why scientists remained unconvinced. Human beings are extraordinarily good at pattern recognition and equally good at finding retroactive meaning in coincidences once we already know the outcome. Finding Rabin's name near a phrase about assassination after Rabin had already been assassinated is a fundamentally different and far weaker kind of evidence than predicting an assassination in a way that could be checked and verified beforehand. By the early 2000s, the scientific consensus on the Bible code had solidified. The original 1994 paper remains a genuinely fascinating case study, not because its conclusion held up, but because of what happened around it. A legitimate, well-respected journal published a paper specifically because its editors couldn't immediately identify the flaw in its statistics, essentially crowdsourcing a rigorous, years-long peer review process to the entire academic community. That process worked exactly as intended. Researchers eventually identified the specific methodological weaknesses, tested them directly by replicating the approach on unrelated texts, and demonstrated conclusively that the ELS method could generate similarly striking patterns in any sufficiently long body of text, religious or otherwise. Doron Witzta Mendelia never fully accepted the rebuttal, and disputes about the details of the statistical methodology continued in academic circles for years afterward, but the broader scientific community, including many statisticians who had no ideological stake in disproving anything about religious texts, largely regarded the McKay and Bar-Hillel rebuttal as a solid demonstration that the original claims did not hold up under controlled scrutiny. The Bible code phenomenon offers something valuable that goes well beyond the specific question of whether hidden messages exist in Genesis. It's a rare, well-documented example of the entire scientific process playing out in public, from an extraordinary claim to peer-reviewed publications specifically designed to invite scrutiny. To rigorous independent replication, to a resolved scientific consensus, all within the space of a decade, all thoroughly documented in academic journals available to anyone who wants to check the record for themselves. It also serves as one of the clearest public illustrations of a problem that shows up constantly in modern research, well beyond religious texts: the danger of flexible pattern matching criteria applied after the fact. Anyone analyzing large datasets, whether hunting for hidden codes, financial market signals, or correlations in scientific data, faces the same fundamental risk. Given enough room to define what counts as a match after already seeing the data, almost any sufficiently large dataset will yield patterns that look statistically extraordinary and mean absolutely nothing. The Bible remains, for billions of people, a text of profound spiritual and historical significance, independent of whether a hidden numerical code runs beneath its Hebrew letters. The scientific investigation into the Bible code didn't settle questions of faith, and it was never really designed to. What it did settle, through a genuinely rigorous and fully documented process, was a much narrower and more testable question: whether the equidistant letter sequence method reveals a uniquely embedded, statistically extraordinary signal found only in the Torah on that specific falsifiable cue. The mathematics community reached a clear and well-supported answer, and the paper trail proving how they got there, from the original 1994 publication through years of rebuttal and counter-rebuttal, remains fully public for anyone willing to read it.